So this webinar is entitled, Whose Stories Are They? And over the next 90 minutes, we will have the opportunity, guided by a panel of experts from a variety of fields, to think together about questions of access, control, and the volatility of archival records related to clergy sexual abuse. My name is John Seitz. I'm the program director of a project entitled Taking Responsibility: Jesuit Institutions Confront the Causes and Legacies of Clerical Sexual Abuse. This grant-funded multi-year research project, sponsored by the Curran Center for American Catholic Studies and the Theology Department here at Fordham, has produced some remarkable results. If you're not familiar with it, I encourage you to check out our webpage, which offers access to the reports of 17 distinct research studies from across Jesuit institutions around the United States on the questions of clerical sexual abuse. There you will also find a final report summarizing the findings, as well as a set of recommendations for leaders of Jesuit institutions and much else. Keep an eye on that website as well, because there you can learn about new publications that are coming forward all the time and new projects that continue to be produced by the research teams from Taking Responsibility. Though the topic of our conversation today may feel somewhat wonky, it's notable that we had over 120 people register to participate in the webinar. I think scholars, activists, survivors, and others understand the human stakes of the questions like these. On the surface, we're talking about paperwork, but beneath the surface, we're talking about the possibility or the denial of truth-telling and narrative, of understanding, insight, and accountability. Moving on, a goal of many in the church today is not necessarily a bad thing, but it does not preclude, and I think indeed would be at best wobbly, fragile, or even dangerous, without maintaining the ballast of thorough, honest, and frankly, ongoing reckoning with painful pasts, which I should add are still unfolding. Springing from a recent legal settlement that promised an abuse documents archive in the Archdiocese of Santa Fe, this webinar explores the meanings, limits, and promise of transparency in the effort to understand and ameliorate the Catholic clergy abuse crisis. Transparency, a term I have heard referred to as the T word because it produces such strong reactions, has become a flashpoint. It was remarkable and perhaps historic when John Wester, the Archbishop of Santa Fe, used the term to describe the goal of the archive agreement reached during the Archdiocese's bankruptcy. As we will see, the archive, though promised over a year ago, has not yet materialized. And so our conversations, while beginning with the settlement in Santa Fe, will not solely concern that situation, but will range widely into the broader questions it and its delay provoke. What's to be learned, gained, and achieved in opening up the archives of Catholic sexual abuse? What kind of healing follows from transparency, if any? Beyond respecting the wishes of survivors who prefer privacy, are there other limitations to consider? What does transparency have to do with Catholic theology or with the practices and disciplines of Catholic systems, structures, and experiences? We will begin with Levi Monagle. Levi is an attorney and advocate for survivors of sexual abuse in religious and carceral settings. Throughout his career, Levi has represented hundreds of victims of sexual abuse in the Archdiocese of Santa Fe, the Diocese of Las Cruces, the Diocese of El Paso and Gallup, and other non-Catholic religious settings. He served as president of the board of directors of the Rape Crisis Center of Central New Mexico, as board chair for Common Cause New Mexico, and as a coalition attorney for the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund. With his law partners, Levi was integral in negotiating the settlement in Santa Fe that stipulated the creation of the Abuse Documents Archive. Next, we will hear from Terry McKiernan, the president of bishopaccountability.org, an archive and research organization devoted to documenting and understanding the Catholic clergy abuse problem. As a result of his work, Terry, I have found, has accrued an encyclopedic understanding of the abuse crisis. With astonishing generosity and insight, he's guided scores of researchers toward the right materials, always with an eye on truth, justice, and accountability. His website, which only presents the surface of his holdings, is the single most important source of information about clerical sexual abuse that exists. Terry was trained in classics and art history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the University of Bristol in England. He worked in academic publishing and consulting before he founded bishopaccountability.org in 2003. He was the archivist of and one of the leaders of the Cushwa Center's Gender, Sex, and Power Project. Terry and bishopaccountability.org received the 2023 Distinguished Service Award from the American Catholic Historical Association. Our third speaker is Katie Holscher, Associate Professor of Religious Studies and American Studies and holder of the Endowed Chair in Roman Catholic Studies at the University of New Mexico. Her first book was Religious Lessons, Catholic Sisters, Public Education, and the Law in Mid-Century New Mexico. Her recent work has dealt especially with Catholic clerical sexual abuse in the context of U.S. Indian missions. She has published longer academic pieces on this, as well as pieces online for journals like National Catholic Reporter and The Revealer. Along with Dr. Jack Downey from the University of Rochester, Dr. Holscher created Desolate Country, an interactive digital mapping project that traces the movements of Catholic priests credibly accused of sexual abuse to missions and through native lands. Dr. Holscher is currently working on co-writing a book on Catholic horror. Katie, an accomplished long-distance runner, is also among the leading scholars today on questions related to tasks. Finally, we'll hear from Jennifer Hasselberger, a canon lawyer with experience in the United States and internationally. Dr. Hasselberger has been a judge on the Metropolitan Tribunal of the Archdiocese of St. Paul and Minneapolis, director of the Tribunal of the Diocese of Crookston, as well as director of the Diocesan Safe Environment Program. After serving as the bishop's delegate for canonical affairs in the Diocese of Fargo, Dr. Hasselberger returned to the Archdiocese of St. Paul and Minneapolis to serve as Chancellor for Canonical Affairs, a position she held until resigning in April of 2013 in protest of the Archdiocese's handling of accusations of clergy sexual abuse. Though she perhaps would not say so herself, Jennifer has been widely celebrated as a courageous whistleblower for her role in that setting. In 2013, she established the Canonical Consultation and Services, LLC. Okay, so we're in the company of some heavy hitters, but we also want to hear from you, the audience members. To that end, each of our speakers will go for about 6 minutes at the start. After that, they will have the opportunity to pose questions or make short additional comments, leading the way into comments from you, the audience. To make this happen, those of you in the webinar audience should write your questions in the Q&A section on Zoom. From Q&A, we will be able to access your questions and relay as many of them as we can for the speakers to discuss. And we'll wrap up around 6 o'clock. As a last note before we begin, I want to offer a couple of thank yous. I'm preceded in taking responsibility by a great team: Brad Hinsey, Catherine Osborne, Christine Fear-Hinsey, Michael Lee. I want to thank Sonia da Silva Montero, the program coordinator, and Maria Terzulli has also been very helpful along the way. And thanks to all you, the attendees, for taking the time to be here today. With that, I want to turn the floor over to our panelists, beginning with Levi.
Thank you, John, and thank you for having me here. I'll move quickly through some of the backstory around the way that the archive came to be, and obviously happy to discuss, in greater detail some of the moving parts as we go forward. The sort of defining moment in the Archdiocese of Santa Fe bankruptcy as it relates to this archive happened at what's called a 341 meeting, a first meeting of creditors, where there's an opportunity for questions to be asked of some of the key figures in the debtors organization. In this case, that was Archbishop Wester of the Archdiocese of Santa Fe. The chairperson of the creditors committee in Santa Fe, a man named Charles Paez, took the opportunity to ask Archbishop Wester some questions. And one of those questions was, would the Archdiocese of Santa Fe commit to an abuse documents archive? And I think to the surprise of Mr. Paez and to the surprise of many of us in the audience there, Archbishop Wester gave an unequivocal yes in response to that question. So at that point, we had a common understanding, right, between the archdiocese and the survivors that were their creditors, that there would be an abuse documents archive of some form. And there were a lot of negotiations over the next 3 years in that bankruptcy. There were financial components to that negotiation with the archdiocese and insurance companies and religious orders, but there were non-financial components to those negotiations as well. New protocols for the listing of priests accused of sexual misconduct, release from old confidentiality orders, compliance auditing, and then this, what I'll call non-negotiable term, the creation of an abuse documents archive. From the perspective of the creditors committee in Santa Fe and the vast majority of the survivors that they represented, the creation of this archive was a non-negotiable term for any plan of reorganization that was going to emerge from the bankruptcy. So if the archdiocese wanted its plan of reorganization, wanted to exit the bankruptcy system, it would have to commit to this archive. And, my partner and mentor, Brad Hall, and I negotiated with the archdiocese pretty painstakingly for about a year over the breadth or narrowness of this term abuse documents before finalizing a memorandum of understanding in April of 2020. The archive that was ultimately promised through the bankruptcy system hinges primarily on this term abuse documents, which is very broadly defined, extends to allegations of abuse and to alleged perpetrators, which is an important subject, is irrespective of document form, meaning documents of all kinds, regardless of their categorization, would be included, and is irrespective of time frame, meaning it extends backwards in perpetuity and I would hope forwards in perpetuity. The archive is public, but is specifically designed to be respectful of survivor privacy. The archive will be redacted of survivor names and identifying information unless this protection is specifically waived by the survivor, and academically administered, which I think was important, certainly to the survivors that we represented. The archive will be housed in the Center for Southwest Research and Special Collections at the University of New Mexico. I think there was an understanding that it was important to have an institution with some assured longevity and resources, as well as a secular institutional housing. And the early stages of the archive's creation will be funded by the Archdiocese of Santa Fe. What was accomplished, I think briefly, with the commitment to an archive was a public commitment, right? A commitment that was made publicly by the Archdiocese, by the Archbishop, to the world at large. It wasn't tailored to one specific survivor or group of survivors even. It was a public commitment. It was a specific commitment with enumerated terms and definitions, and I think it was a precedential commitment, meaning that other survivors in other contexts could point to the creation of this abuse documents archive and say, we need to do this. This is possible. This is practical. What it did not accomplish, at least yet, is, I think John touched on this, an actual working archive, meaning it's not like you can go to the Center for Southwest Research and Special Collections today and start digging through these documents. There have been some logistical difficulties there. I don't think the archival arrangement has accomplished an assurance of completeness, right? No mechanism really for ensuring that all abuse documents are really produced to CSWR. And I'm not sure, and this is, I think, a very important topic for conversation, whether the commitment to this archive has produced a shift in the Archdiocese of Santa Fe's own perspective over the ownership or authorship of these stories, or the sort of larger truth-telling function in all of this. And so I really hope we can dig into that later, but that's sort of the overview of the archive from my perspective, and I'll pass the mic.
Thank you so much, Terry. You're up. Thank you so much, Levi.
Well, it's great to be in this webinar with Levi and Jennifer, and to be working again with you, Katie. Many thanks to John and Sonia for organizing this, and to everyone who's participating, especially the survivors. I'm going to talk about clergy abuse archives from 3 perspectives, and I think I am going to read because I'm worried about time. Otherwise, I'm going to be a little over 6 as it is. I'm going to look at this as an archivist, as someone who is really focused on doing research on confessional abuse, and also as a collector of oral histories. Now, this visionary archive that Levi has just described really could be a game changer, I think, for all of us. I hope it'll inspire, as Levi touched on, all future settlements to release an archive of their own. I also hope that the online archives that we already have will inspire Santa Fe and UNM to construct this as an online archive so that it's accessible to everyone, including survivors, wherever they might be. Now, I hope we'll learn a lot about the servants of the Paraclete from this archive. Now, their headquarters was in the Santa Fe Archdiocese, and they evaluated and treated likely thousands of offending priests, and allowing many of them to work and reoffend in Santa Fe parishes. Sonia, I think, will put a link in the chat to a page that has a document about all of that, and also some other sources. Now, priests came to Santa Fe for treatment from nearly every diocese in the country. I hope documents about them in the Santa Fe archive will talk with the many Paraclete documents in the archives that we already have, so that a kind of dialogue or conversation will occur between the archives as a result of this new one. Now, archives have been posted online or released in about 24 US dioceses so far, and a few religious order provinces, totaling about 250,000 pages. It's extraordinary that we have these documents at all. This is certainly a new development in the history of Catholicism. And we have them through the courage, really, of one young man, a Shanley survivor named Gregory Ford, whose case made the Boston Archive public and started the whole spotlight cascade. There are also millions of pages of documents in courthouses and in the hands of people who have worked on the problem. Survivors, most importantly, attorneys, expert witnesses, authors, journalists, whistleblowers, and more. My organization, I'll call us BA, has collected more than 1 million pages from these other sources. What's more, government inquiries in Australia and Northern Ireland have posted large archives of documents as exhibits with transcripts of hearings, providing context that we don't see in most US archives where we're only looking at the documents themselves. In Ireland, Germany, and other European countries, as many of you are aware, reports have quoted from documents without releasing them, providing a more mediated window into those archives. And yet the documents that we have are a drop in the bucket, perhaps 5% of the total abuse documents in the United States, even with the Santa Fe archive, and much less elsewhere. I do hope that Santa Fe inspires other document releases. Perhaps in the US, we'll eventually see a government inquiry and more documents. Maybe the next Pope will open the Vatican's huge archives of clergy abuse. But what do we do in the meantime? The experience that I had as the archivist on the Gender, Sex, and Power project that, John, you mentioned, led by Kathy Cummings, showed me that church documents can be complemented and vice versa by many other sources, from data all the way up to survivor witness. A few examples of this complementing. In that project, the German scholar Doris Reisinger was able to study how priests abused girls and then forced them to have abortions. She brings together church documents, survivors' writings, reports, journalism, even the audio and transcript of a trial. Mary Dispenza at SNAP just donated her personal archive to BA, including poems, clippings, and her first handwritten letters to the Archdiocese about her abuse, which later appeared, those letters, when the Los Angeles Archdiocese released her abuser's file. In her oral history, she'll bring together the documents, her great memoir Split, and her activism with victims of abuse by nuns. In the Australian Royal Commission documents, we meet Julie Stewart, who describes her abuse in confession and actually draws a map of the confession room and shares a poem and a childhood photograph. Different sources and different archives complement each other in the highly replicated structure of Catholicism. This allows us, I think, to understand abuse even in dioceses where the archives are sparse. But transparency is a dream, isn't it? Instead of the clear view of that metaphor, survivors and their allies fight for the documents, which are destroyed, withheld, redacted, and skewed by their context. Stories, quote unquote, too, are only a partial representation of this huge catastrophe that we're dealing with. Not only the personal stories, but the bigger stories we tell ourselves, that celibacy or homosexuality is to blame, permissiveness or orthodoxy. Instead, I hope that we can sometimes camp out in the archives between transparency and the stories and spend some time simply with the documents and oral histories and other sources where the stories really begin. Whose stories are they? I loved Mary Dispenza's memoir Split and Stephen Bernard's memoir Paper Cuts, and I'm really looking forward to Doris Reisinger's No More I. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Terry. Katie.
All right. Thank you, John, and taking accountability for having us all here. I'm really excited to be in conversation with this set of folks. Okay, so I'm a historian of Catholicism, and as part of my job for the last couple of decades, I've visited archives controlled by Catholic institutional entities to learn about different parts of 19th and 20th century Catholic life. In addition, for the last 5 years, I've been working closely with archival material related to Catholic clerical sexual abuse specifically. And I'm also, as John mentioned, faculty at University of New Mexico, the institution that has received and is now processing the Archdiocese of Santa Fe material. So if I can offer insight later about things specific to UNM as a repository for this archive, I'd be happy to. In my initial remarks, though, I'm going to focus on my own experience as a historian, moving between clerical abuse archival material on one hand and church archives on the other. And as a clarification of terms, here I'm using church archive as shorthand for archives that are actually controlled by multiple Catholic entities, including dioceses, male and female religious orders, as well as Catholic institutions of higher education. I should begin by saying that I've never gone into a church archive intending to find documents directly related to clerical sexual abuse. And in part, that's because historians who spend time in church archives know that a request like that made to an archivist, I'm looking for material about sex abuse, will get you nowhere. And we know that it's best not to burn bridges with archivists because archivists have a lot of control. They don't have total control, but they have significant control over what a researcher is and isn't able to access in a church-controlled archive. But I also have never gone looking for abuse documents in church archives because I've been really fortunate to have Terry as a collaborator and to have had access to the phenomenal archival holdings of Bishop Accountability. Terry mentioned the Gender, Sex, and Power Project, which we worked together on, but I've actually had Terry's help for much longer than that. Terry, I remember 10, 12 years ago, I first contacted you when Robert Orsi recommended it because I was doing a project on Vatican II here in the Archdiocese of Santa Fe, and I wanted to understand how the Vatican II sort of corresponded to the sexual abuse happening down here at the time. And you sort of pointed me towards some documents, and since then the rest is history, right? So even though most of my material about clerical abuse that I use in my work is thanks to Terry and Bishop Accountability, church archives and issues of transparency and accessibility related to them are still really important to me. As a historian, my approach to clerical abuse is not to study it as an aberration, not to study it as something that is out of the ordinary or separate from the ordinary of Catholic institutional life, but rather to study it as a horrible phenomenon that existed in close relation to normal elements of Catholic institutional life. And so when I go into a church archive, I'm not looking for smoking gun documents. Rather, I'm looking at boring material, church paperwork, records, student enrollments, financial reports that will enable me to flush out the texture of the institutional worlds in which abuse occurred. So to offer a concrete example, some of my research looks at clerical abuse as something that happened frequently on Catholic missions to amid Catholic missions to Native people. When it comes to documents that directly comment on that abuse, including survivor testimonies or personnel files that record priests' self-reporting behavior, bishop accountability has been really helpful. But I want to understand the everyday mission context in which that abuse happened. And so for that, one place I can go is archives of the religious orders who ran those missions. So for example, 2 summers ago, a colleague and I spent time at the Jesuit archive at St. Louis University, and we poured through records related to mission boarding schools. Based on other records available to us, we already knew these institutions were places where abuse occurred. As I already mentioned, when you're not looking for abuse documents per se, it's easier to gain access to church archives. But that doesn't mean that accessibility and transparency problems go away. The Jesuit archive at SLU, to stick with that example, is one of the best run, I think, and most broadly accessible Catholic archives in the United States. I want to give it credit for that. But even there, my colleague and I repeatedly ran into folders marked with red stickers. The archivist was apologetic, but also clear that those folders had been marked at some point as containing sensitive or restricted material. The folders were available to us, but it was clear that they were missing documents. We ran into the problem of priest personnel files being closed per archive policy for 50 years following a priest's death. So you can't even see a personnel file until 50 years have passed after a priest dies. And we also noticed that records related to one mission, an institution that's especially interesting to us because of the large number of abuse accusations there, we noticed that its records were all but missing when it came to the 1960s, the decade that most accusations point back to. To be clear, I don't think the archivist at SLU was withholding those mission records from us. I think they'd been lost somewhere along the way prior to arriving at SLU, which raises an important point. We often talk about records related to sexual abuse, or boarding schools for that matter, as being intentionally restricted, concealed, or destroyed. And we know that happens, especially when Catholic entities are still staring down possibilities of litigation or bankruptcy. But in my experience, factors like incompetence, disorganization, insufficient staffing often loom just as large as obstacles to transparency. In fact, oftentimes the same institutional dysfunction that helps create conditions for abuse 50 years ago creates the conditions under which records from the same period fail to survive. And I think that's probably what happened in the case of that mission during the 60s. To offer one more example, 5 years ago, I was doing research on the early years of the Diocese of Gallup, which is right next door to the Archdiocese of Santa Fe, and is the nation's first and only quote unquote Indian diocese. And it's also another hotspot for clerical abuse. I contacted the diocesan archive or the diocesan archivist, because I wanted to find material related to the founding of the diocese in the middle of the 20th century. I wasn't especially hopeful because this is the language posted on the diocese's webpage, and I'm just going to quote it. Quote, "This archive is restricted and private institutional repository. Its primary duty is to serve the bishop, curial offices in Catholic parishes. Therefore, access is generally limited to such uses. On rare occasions, select portions of the archive may be available to researchers. However, this is subject to approval by the chancellor. The approval may be withheld according to the chancellor's sole and absolute discretion." So I wasn't hopeful emailing that archivist, having read that language. And indeed, the Gallup archivist's response to my query was that she didn't have anything for me. And remember, I wasn't looking for abuse documents. I was looking for documents about the founding of the diocese. Is it true she didn't have anything for me? I'm not sure, But she also saw fit to remind me in her reply that Gallup is, quote, the poorest diocese in the United States, and, quote, it reflects its poverty in its archives. So, right, I mean, there's something about the poverty and the insufficient funds that that diocese has that also is a barrier to transparency and accessibility. I was able to finally find some limited material about the Diocese of Gallup, but to do that, I had to actually go to the far better supported archives of the Archdiocese of Santa Fe. So hopefully these anecdotes illuminate a bit about the challenges of doing research related to Catholic clerical abuse. And in conclusion, I'll just say that as excited as I am about the new archive at UNM, it's really important that the Archdiocese of Santa Fe also make its broader archive up in Santa Fe broadly accessible to researchers so that we can do the kind of contextual work that's important to understanding the documents that are going to end up in the Center for Southwest Research at UNM. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Katie. Appreciate that very much. Jennifer, your turn. Thank you so much, everyone.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, John, for your kind words. And thank you to everyone who's participating today. It's lovely to be able to speak about this. Also a little bit awkward for me to follow this because, of course, I was the chancellor, the person who was the guardian, custodian, and gatekeeper of all the records for a number of dioceses. So I'm going to kind of speak from that perspective. I'm going to try and provide some context around how the church at large and the hierarchy, I should say, when I say church, the hierarchy in both Santa Fe and in the church elsewhere is going to be interpreting these agreements, because I think some of that information is going to be a little bit different than what you might have heard before. So I want to just kind of start by providing people with a context for what an archdiocese is and how it fits into the structure of the Catholic Church, so that everyone understands what we're talking about when we say the Archdiocese of Santa Fe. And I think the first thing that's important to recognize is that's not a static entity, right? We just alluded to it a little bit with talk of the creation of the Diocese of Gallup. So the way that the church views the world, if you will, is that every place that humans are on this globe is under the control of the Holy Father. But he can't possibly minister to all of us. And so he divides the territory into what is called dioceses. And each diocese is given a bishop who acts in the role of the Holy Father for that particular group of people. Okay, so it's always a territory that has people within it. And then there's a further delineation, because the bishop as well, when he's given that territory and all the people with it, can't possibly minister to them. So dioceses are divided up even smaller into parishes. And that parish is led by a pastor who is the representative of the bishop. But as humanity has expanded across the world, as different factors have come into play, that the shape of those divisions changes. So much so that for the last 40 years or so, the diocese or Archdiocese of Orlando has also had control of the territory of space, because we have humans in space now. And so you have to have a bishop to minister to them as well. So when you understand that especially in a place like the United States, we started out with a few dioceses in the more populous areas. And then we had all sorts of mission territory that was being controlled that way. And it was only as the population was moving that dioceses were developed. So when we talk about the Archdiocese of Santa Fe, we're talking about something that was only started in 1875. And at that moment in 1875, it was kind of carved out of territories that had belonged to other dioceses before that. So the records that they would have, we're talking about 1875. But the Archdiocese of Santa Fe has not stayed the same since 1875. It lost territory twice. And that means that there was a subdivision first in the 1930s for the Diocese of Gallup, and then later in the 1980s for the Diocese of Las Cruces. Now, it's possible to find what we'll call the historical documents regarding those changes, right? So you're going to see like the decree erecting the new diocese and appointing the new bishop. It's usually effective on one day, but there's going to be an installation like maybe a month later, things like that. But the truth is that those divisions were for all sorts of different reasons. Some of them had to do with the actual needs of the people in the territory. Sometimes it happened because a bishop didn't like somebody and they needed to get him into like a lateral move away from the bishop where there was a lot of quarrels. There's actually really popular, well-known examples of that having happened. Generally, the archbishop or the bishop of the diocese that's losing territory knows what's coming. And so what's most important to us is, as you would imagine would happen in a secular context, when you're going to be losing territory, everything that's valuable that's in that territory, you bring back to the place that you're going to keep it. And everything that you want to get rid of, you send to the place that you're losing. Because at the moment that the new diocese is created, all of the priests who are assigned in parishes in the diocese of the territory that is no longer part of the original diocese become priests of that territory. All of those parishes become parishes in that diocese. Everything that's physically present there stays in the new territory. So there's a lot of maneuvering that happens. And I think that's something that we really have to keep to think about when we're thinking about dioceses and how people wound up where they were a lot of times when you see these kind of divisions. Okay. So I think it's really important to think about that. The same thing should happen with the records. So if a priest is now moved to a new diocese because a new diocese was created, his records should follow. The records of those parishes should follow. So sometimes to find that information, you have to understand all of that history and how it played out. But I think most of us know that in addition to our diocesan priests, right, priests who are ordained to serve in a certain diocese for their entire career, there's also religious order priests and religious women. They're not affiliated to a diocese. They're going to be affiliated to a religious institute. And it's the religious institute that will have the majority of the records about them, but also that is the decision maker when it comes to where they are. And that takes a couple of different contexts when we're talking about parishes in the diocese and we're talking about what you'll find in the archive. Especially in the Southwest, the US Southwest, oftentimes the religious orders preceded the development of a diocese, right? Because they were coming from other directions, from the Spanish, from things like that. So the religious orders were often there first, okay? They were given a task by the Pope or their religious superior to create a parish in that area. And they're able to have priests and others, religious women, if you will, outside of the supervision of the diocesan bishop. That's one way that that arrangement can happen. The other arrangement can be that a bishop creates a new parish or has a parish that he needs to staff, and he invites a religious order in to take control either completely or just by assigning priests. In that case, there's a shared oversight with the diocese and the order. But so again, in the Catholic Southwest, oftentimes those religious institutes were there first. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind when we're talking about these records. I know that we need to kind of move on and we got started late, but I just wanted to talk really quickly about some of the other challenges when dealing with this and why we might be having an issue in getting the records actually made available. One thing to consider is the definitions that we're talking about, because again, these aren't static. As I read the agreement, it talked about sexual abuse of minors, or sorry, of children, clergy who have been involved in that. I think it's important to understand how the church is going to understand that. Okay, until 1992, somebody who sexually abused a minor in the church was understood to have been involved with somebody who was under the age of 16. Okay, not 18. It became 18 in the United States in 1992, and then it changed to 18 for the Universal Church in 2002. Then we moved backwards, because starting around the mid-2000s, they created a provision that said, unless we're talking about child pornography, in which case the age was originally 15 and now is 14. So that's going to be something that you should also keep in mind with what records are going to be made available. Lastly, I think it's important to understand that the church has no operating definition of what sexual abuse is, right? We work on the idea that it's a crime against the sixth commandment with somebody involving a certain age or somebody who lacks capacity. But in terms of the acts, the involvements, the church has never been able to specify that. And instead, they always say, rely on the opinions of religious scholars, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's something that I think we have to keep in mind as we're understanding how the church is going to respond to the commitments that it made. And again, I think that's why we have to focus on the fact that this was an agreement that the Archbishop of Santa Fe entered into. He couldn't bind the religious orders. He couldn't bind the Diocese of Las Cruces or Gallup. He couldn't, he's limited in the power that he has in terms of making things available, because he's not, he himself is just a designee. So, I'm sure all of these things are factors that are contributing to the slowness of getting the archive up and going. John, I mean, I can keep going on, but
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I so appreciate it. Let's see here. No, thank you. Yeah, my computer just froze there for a moment. Can you hear me okay now? Okay. All right. Thanks, everybody. So I would like to invite the panelists here for a moment to ask any questions of one another. I want to begin, however, with just a quick question of my own for Levi. A couple of different folks have mentioned in their comments the differences and the important distinctions between religious orders and diocesan organization. And I wondered if you could report a little bit from your experience in the negotiations around this settlement. What was the involvement, if any, of religious orders? And to what degree were there representatives available or present? And how did they interact with the whole movement that you were initiating in your conversations with the Archdiocese?
Yeah, so I'll say that the role of any of the religious orders or their council in the negotiations around the abuse documents archive was minimal. They weren't interested in participating in those negotiations. Their religious ordinaries had not made any kind of commitment to turn over documents en masse to a public secular archive. And I mean, one of the perversities of the bankruptcy system, frankly, was that the only reason they were involved in the first place was so that they could jump on the bandwagon of a bankruptcy release once the Archdiocese had done all the heavy lifting of negotiating with survivors. And that was ultimately what happened. Religious orders contributed relatively small sums. Once they knew that the Archdiocese and its insurance companies had sort of contributed a critical mass of financial consideration and non-monetary consideration, enough to sort of satisfy survivors that, okay, like we can live with this. The religious orders were there at the end to say, oh, hey, like we'll throw in a little more, like a little more is great, right? And to get release from all of their past liabilities as a result of that. I think the bankruptcy system and the Supreme Court, frankly, is on the verge of grappling with some of those bankruptcy issues, but the role of the religious orders in either the crafting of the abuse documents archive or its parameters was minimal. And I think their interest in participating in any meaningful way now would be relatively minimal as well.
Can I just piggyback on that a little bit? Because we talked a lot about the servants of the Paraclete. And I think that's a perfect example that kind of highlights really well what I was talking about when I was talking about the differences between the religious orders and authorities. Because I think a lot of those of us who know the servants of the Paraclete, and I can remember that I was in Crookston for a while, which had one of the Paraclete homes and had a lot of Paraclete priests in its territories. So, you know, Fitzgerald was actually a priest of the Holy Cross. Okay, so his supervision when he started the Paracletes was actually the Order of the Holy Cross. He had the intention of founding a new order, but until that new order was founded, he remained a priest of Holy Cross. So, you know, if you're looking for his records and things like that, that's where you're gonna have to start. Then he came to the Paracletes, or he founded the Paracletes with the idea of creating a very different type of entity. Holy Cross, they're out in the world. They have an apostolate, an active apostolate. What he was considering as much more of a monastic type environment. And so he would eventually affiliate the Paracletes with the Carmelites. And for a very small time in that process, just because of the normal way that this happens in the church, when you're in the process of creating a new order, if you will, you could go through a very small period of time where you're gaining members, where you have some involvement with the bishop of the diocese where your primary institution is located. But you know, that's not, I think, how we would think about it for any other kind of situation in terms of oversight of priests in a diocese. So really a lot of what came to happen in Santa Fe is going to be tied to Holy Cross, and then also the Paracletes, neither of who were a part of this.
Thank you so much. Did anyone? We have some questions building up in the Q&A, but I wanted to give the panelists just a moment to respond to anything that they wanted to before turning it over to the Q&A.
You know, if I could pose a quick question to Levi, it's archivally, this arrangement is so fascinating because there are streams of archival documents coming from the Archdiocese, also coming from you folks and your law firm. And it seems from the agreement also potentially at least from other law firms. And I know from these amazing documents that you guys have released already that your documents include religious order documents. And I'm curious how much you think your collection and perhaps archives coming from other attorneys are going to supply the lack that we might see because religious orders aren't on the bandwagon. And then a really cool part of the I think of the non-monetary, I think it's in there, is that there's an option for survivors to contribute their own materials to the archive as the archive continues. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about both of those facts.
Sure. And I'll so to the first point, Terry, I think that in sort of the cross currents of litigation, you end up with documents from religious orders, just as you end up with documents from like a diocesan entity or archive. And frequently those documents are bound up, at least in the courts of litigation, by confidentiality orders prompted normally by the lawyers for the diocese. And so one of the provisions of the Archdiocese of Santa Fe bankruptcy, one of the provisions of the archival agreement was that those confidentiality orders that previously restricted, you know, the free movement of documents from the hands of survivors to anyone outside of the litigation process are rescinded. And the Archdiocese is no longer going to be in a position to insist upon the legality or efficacy of its confidentiality orders. And frequently there were not any separate confidentiality orders with respect to the religious orders involved in litigation. And so I think that, you know, documents, certainly like someone in my situation or any other attorney situation is going to have to continue to honor viable confidentiality orders from a court. But to the extent that the only confidentiality orders in place for a particular case were confidentiality orders entered into with an archdiocese, or those agreements are abrogated by the plan of your organization. You see entities like the archdiocese at the sort of the crossroads for a lot of different communication traffic, right, between religious orders, between people in the secular spheres. And so this sort of patchy nature that I think Jennifer was referring to, where you'll get sort of a sliver of an archive through one diocese, and then there's so much else that has to be referred to elsewhere. It certainly matters with like the Archdiocese of Santa Fe, but they just happen to be at sort of a busy crossroads, I think, for a variety of reasons. And so what you end up with in an archive like this, I think, is just a large pile of loose threads to pull on, and that is a fruitful endeavor. To your second question, I think that we talked and thought about this a lot, and I think had a lot of feedback from survivors on this. Like, every survivor is different, right? And the preference to contribute a story, or to contribute a part of a story but not a whole story, or to contribute nothing at all, right, had to be accounted for here. And so the simplest thing ultimately to do was to say that if you opt in, you can opt in whole or in part, but you'll always have the opportunity to come to this permanent archive and contribute as much or as little of your story as you wish to. And that's built into the arrangement as well. I mean, I think that this archive is tempting to think of it as, you know, there will be one giant dump truck of information dropped into the archive, and then it'll just get sorted out and be static. But I don't think that's certainly not intended to be the case, right? There's an intent that there's a rolling production of abuse documents, for instance, from the archdiocese. If there are new allegations against new perpetrators, you know, the hope would be that those are considered to be abuse documents by the archdiocese and are contributed to an archive. So, but you know, you made the point earlier, and I think it's a critically important one for us to discuss at some point, that transparency is something of a dream, and you know, the contours of that dream are what we're here to discuss.
Can I just interject for a second and also say that we might be working on, or we're not, but there's probably some different understandings of what we're talking about when we even say the word archive, right? Because I think that means something to people who have a background in library science, creating archives, historians, people who are used to working with them, and people who are used to working with them in a church context. Because I can tell you, in the diocese that, you know, I was a part of, we had what we would refer to as the archives, right? That's the thing that you can find when you look on the website, and it talks about how you can get access to certain things. The things that we thought, you know, that were like the archives in that sense tended to be more generic historical records, parish bulletins, parish histories, sometimes letters from bishops about important events. We had the wooden foot of one of our priests who lost it in a freak snowstorm. You know, there's all kinds of documents and things that were part of that. What was never a part of the quote unquote archives were clergy files, departmental files like school files, religious order files, financial files, the bishop's personal files. None of that was ever part of the archives, and ever even under the purview of the archivist, for a reason of the archivist. Okay, again, I'm going to use quotes, because for a long time, the role of the archivist, they weren't kind of given access to any of that, because before the church had effective processes for dealing with offending clergy, one of the big things that you did with priests who are offenders, if they couldn't be put back into a parish, was you gave them one of two roles in the diocese, which didn't involve any contact with children. The first was working on the marriage tribunal, and the second was being the archivist. So, you know, take that, I'll always take that into account when you're thinking about, you know, the archives. I know that there's been a lot of kind of talk, and there's a lot of suspicion about things that are destroyed, lost. I think there was a very good point made about, just a lack of resources in a lot of places. Again, maybe not having a trained archivist, whereas bigger dioceses have now moved away from having those, offending priests as archivists and moved into a lay model. When they're hiring people who have background in records management, library science, things like that, you're going to see the introduction of things like retention schedules that are going to contribute to the destruction of certain types of documents. Okay. But generally that's going to be financial information and things like that. In my own experience, I can tell you that when it comes to priest files, the minute there was a litigation hold, the priest files themselves would go to the attorney's office because the attorneys would need them for responding to discovery requests and the like. I was in dioceses where we would have either search and seize orders or subpoena orders that were delivered to the diocese. I can tell you that no records were ever destroyed in that process. Instead, and Levi probably has seen this happen, the approach is to seal all of the documents with a notice that they shouldn't be unsealed except on the order of a judge, and then the process will start of contesting whether those documents are going to be admitted as part of the process.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say one final thing, that in my experience, the documents that we found that have been that I personally saw that were most distressing relating to these issues tended not to be things that were in the clergy files.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Jennifer and Levi. Sonia, are you able to present some questions from the audience Q&A? I know several of them have come in so far, and I think we can combine some of them into one perhaps in the interest of time, but why don't you take over here?
Yep. Thank you. And thank you so much for this important conversation. I will just start with this first question that comes from Paige Anderson, a survivor and archival researcher that also worked with bishop accountability, and relates to the issue of including religious orders. So the question would be how we consider building inclusive archival records as part of settlements with dioceses, but also to push for a broader inclusion of religious orders, of Catholic sisters and the Jesuits in the archives, and other orders as well.
Well, I'll say that there are plenty of religious orders going into their own Chapter 11 bankruptcies right now. If we have a sense of the possibility of demanding these sorts of archival arrangements or better archival arrangements, frankly, for future bankruptcies, I think that's a forum for these conversations to unfold in a pretty pointed way. And I'd be very curious to hear others' thoughts on that.
I mean, I would just, I don't have an answer, but to sort of state the obvious, I mean, I think that the conversation, particularly about the Archdiocese of Santa Fe, has to include not only the servants of the Paraclete, but also the Franciscans in like a really major way, right? Yeah. The Franciscans have not been, I mean, even compared to the Jesuits, it's really hard to get information on the Franciscans.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I would say religious orders have been very skillful in using the tendency of the media and also the public at large to focus on dioceses as a way of kind of slipping under the radar. And Paige, I know, is especially interested in orders of religious sisters. And I think survivors of non-abuse would say that you ain't seen nothing until you've seen how resistant to scrutiny female religious orders can be. So if their problems, and I would guess they won't, never rise to the level that a bankruptcy is contemplated, we're still left with the problem that learning anything about female religious orders and abuse therein is extremely hard. But maybe, Levi, if the approach you're suggesting or anticipating actually happens, more scrutiny on religious orders in general will kind of flow over into the female religious orders, and we'll begin to learn something more about them as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the trend towards diocesan or religious order bankruptcies is mapping pretty closely with the trends toward statute of limitations reform right across the country. So you'll see this sort of back and forth between, you know, you'll see survivors working in the legislature to reform a statute of limitations within their jurisdiction. And if they're successful, the writing is sort of on the wall that bankruptcies are coming. If that's the case, right, and if there's a sort of a critical mass of claims against a particular religious order arising out of one of these jurisdictions, the planning can begin. You know, if this religious order goes into the bankruptcy system, we're going to be here to demand the creation of an archive or to demand some degree of document disclosure, public document disclosure as a condition of any voluntary plan of reorganization.
I think one thing that is going to be challenging with the religious orders, though, is that unlike the dioceses in the United States, their leadership structure is going to be outside of the United States. And what they do is they separately incorporate in a state, like a particular convent or a particular school or something like that. And so your bankruptcy is only going to touch that entity. And so I think there's like just structurally, there's going to be some challenges there. The dioceses are more appealing for a lot of reasons because they're located all within a state with one exception, a few exceptions.
I mean, these agreements are just words ultimately, right? Like if there's an agreement by the Archdiocese of Santa Fe or any other entity to say, okay, like, yeah, we're going to produce all of our abuse documents. Here's the definition. Here's how it's interpreted. We're going to produce them all. Are you, right? Like it creates a whole bunch of other questions about like, okay, cool. Like who's going to enforce this now, right? If there are doubts about the comprehensiveness of a production, who is going to come in and be able to say with standing that you haven't produced the records for Father so-and-so, right? Like he was clearly accused of abuse. His documents are clearly abuse documents. Like you need to put those in the archive. There's this constant ongoing tug and pull between, I think, secular sources and Catholic hierarchical sources over whose stories are they, right? Whose documents are they? And it is an incredibly important tug and pull, right, that's still going on, and it's going to continue going on, I'm sure, for the foreseeable future.
Yeah. I mean, how do you monitor compliance? You go through this all the time, Levi, but I mentioned Paul Shanley earlier. Eric McLeish went through, if I'm not mistaken, 7 document productions about that guy, and he still didn't get everything.
Yeah.
And part of it is that these documents are their personnel files, their secret archive files, their tribunal files. They're squirreled away in all kinds of places that, Jennifer, you could speak to much more capably than I. But they're hard specifically to require. And if you can't specify them, they won't be turned over. And sometimes even when you do specify them, they won't be.
Since you mentioned a specific thing, I'll just tell you that, as somebody who has seen the entirety of the Porter file, if you will, the most significant thing that I ever saw was actually the marriage file, which wouldn't have fallen within any of the discovery orders or this order, right? Because after Porter was laicized, he entered into marriage. And at the time, the church knew his history. And so there was a discussion as part of his required Catholic premarital counseling as to whether they would disclose to his future wife his prior sexual abuse of children. that would never have come up. In the end, I think everyone knows that they didn't. He went on to abuse at least one of his own children. But I think that's kind of what I'm referring to when I say that would never have fallen within any of this.
Thank
Sonia.
you. Yes, I just to add to this question, but and move into a little bit different direction, just to add this comment coming from the Q&A that many retired orders are donating or have donated their collections to university archives. How does this factor into the goal of making these records accessible, and if it factors, but also, still on the question of expanding the archives and the importance of this work, another participant shares that they have been submitting their own records to archives and collected records since 1972, but their concern is that we are losing the records of those abused over the age of 18, especially those assaulted as residents of Catholic college and universities. So what can be done to expand archives to include these abusers, especially since canon law now includes abuse of adults? And is there anyone or any institution exploring these situations of college students as adults being abused by priests? So these two questions. Thank you.
Katie, I'm very curious about your perspective on sort of the distribution of either religious order collections or other Catholic collections to university archives specifically, and how you go about stitching together a comprehensive picture there, if you can.
It's yeah, religious order archives are just really hard to track, and it's getting harder and harder as a lot of these religious orders are aging out, right? I mean, this is a lot of I was trying to track down records for some Dominican sisters who had worked at a boarding school in Eastern Washington a couple of summers ago. And at some point, that Dominican order had sort of gotten so small that it had combined into the Sinsinawa Dominicans. And the Sinsinawa Dominicans have an archivist, but she had no, and she was great, but the records didn't end up with her, right? And and then right, and some, I mean, in an ideal, I mean, the Jesuits, like I said, I think, I mean, as despite the limitations of the Jesuit archive, I mean, the Jesuit archival model is great if people can replicate it, because it's held at SLU, it's very well managed. It's difficult because all the Jesuit provinces centralized their archives, which I think meant that some of the sort of regional archivists that had particular kinds of local histories and kind of institutional histories, that kind of knowledge got lost when those archives were centralized. It also makes people living in different parts of the country, it makes it harder for them to access those archives now that they're all in St. Louis. But the benefit that came with it is that now they're, I would say, quite professionally managed at a Catholic institution of higher education. That's that doesn't really answer the question, only to say that I think if it's done right, when religious order archives get to institutions of higher education, it can be great.
Thank you so much. I think there was a question built into Sonia's last piece about older victims. Does anyone want to jump on that question?
I'll comment briefly. I guess really to plead guilty. Our approach at bishopaccountability.org, as everyone knows, I'm sure, has been to draw the line at 18, and to devote the database of accused to people who offended against minors. And honestly did that, I think, because it was the cleanest way to go, not because we thought that abuse of adults was unimportant, less important, or anything of that sort. I think there was also some concern simply about legal questions, and we didn't want to get into a thicket where there was a debate about consent and abuse and all of the complexities that surround um, the abuse of adults. And we realize, as I think many people are realizing, that that's just not the right way to go. We still feel that our database as it's set up has a logic about it because of the time limit, but we do feel like we have a responsibility to begin treating these other cases in a serious way and foregrounding them in the work that we do. I don't know whether other archives are facing up to this. The Catholic Church is just in a very, very confusing way, honestly, beginning to face up to it itself. And we feel we need to also, but we're in the early stages of that.
So maybe I can go and try another question. I have here a question, and now I think coming from another attendee, and I will quote this one. When I worked in Zimmerman in the 70s, the official Catholic directories were in the reference department. When I came back in the 90s, they were in the stacks. When I came back a few years later, they were gone. If UNM could be that restrictive, what means are there to make sure they will not hide more?
Yes, I
Does
guess
everybody know what the Catholic directory is?
I can talk to that. So I mean, I've been at UNM now for 10 years. There has never been a full edition of the official Catholic directory in the stacks since I've been there that I know of. I don't know where it went. I think it must have gone somewhere before I got there. I know that the archives, the Archdiocesan archives up in Santa Fe has a full edition of the official Catholic directory that I've gone up there and they've let me use before, right? Which is not the same as having it housed at a public institution. I mean, I can also say just a little bit about maybe what's going on with the archive at UNM. So, I mean, this is, it gets back to sort of problems of transparency, right? I mean, the Catholic Church has problems of transparency. Public institutions with not a lot of funding also have problems when it comes to transparency and accessibility, right? I mean, at UNM, the Center for Southwest Research, the director that cared about this a fair amount left, and to my knowledge they still haven't found a new director. Maybe they haven't, I just don't know about it, but that position was empty for quite a while. And the search for they're hiring someone with archdiocesan money, right? They're hiring someone to process the archive before they make it available, and that hiring process is still in process, right? They haven't made a hire yet. And so the archive through the Center for Southwest Research is not going to become open to the public or to me or to any researcher until they hire somebody to process it, and that person begins processing it. And last I heard that they're going to start releasing it in batches as soon as they have that person in place processing the archive. And
everybody can buy the Catholic directory. It's published by the Kennedy Directory. Any entity can buy it. And actually every entity within a diocese is going to have a copy of at least their section for every year. And that's because the real purpose of the Catholic directory is the group ruling. So every Catholic organization in a diocese gets its tax exempt status by virtue of being included in the Catholic directory. So they have copies of it because they frequently have to provide them to donors, the IRS, all sorts of organizations.
Yeah. One wonderful development as far as the Catholic directory goes is that the Internet Archive now offers almost a full set from the late 1800s. And I'll actually add a link to that page, to this page that I mentioned earlier, which is bishopaccountability.org/ documents, plural, dash, Fordham dash webinar. And it's quite searchable. It's missing a couple of volumes, but anyone who's using it and runs afoul of those gaps, please contact me and I'd be happy to help.
Thank you. Yes,
I do,
please.
if I could say one more thing, I do worry, $47,000 is not a lot of money to pay this archivist who's going to have to process this for 2 years. And then what happens after that? And UNM is not rich. And I really worry that the very, very steep copy charges that are now on the Special Collections website are going to apply to this collection as well. And there may need to be a specific endowment for this to protect survivors and others who don't have a lot of money who want to use this archive. And for this to be, Levi, as you say, a precedent for the future, and I think that's a great idea, it's going to have to be a good precedent, and a good precedent is going to have to be accessible.
Yeah, I think that it is easy to think of something like this as like a fait accompli, and it's not, right? Like,
yeah,
this is an inch, right? And now it's about what happens next to take the mile, right? You give an inch, take a mile, but you got to take it, right? There has to be a proactive sort of response to all of this. If it's like, okay, like here's this little commitment, and it can be interpreted as broadly or narrowly as someone insists upon, right? And if we're quiet about it, it's interpreted narrowly. And the louder we are about it, and the more work that's done on it, the broader it can be. Katie, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add just another, I think to your point, Levi, that we also have to keep in mind that Archbishop Wester, I think, is 74. And when bishops turn 75, they offer to resign, right, to the Pope. And so I don't expect Archbishop Wester to be Archbishop for more than another year or two, honestly. And so to the extent that he is somebody who cares about transparency, which I think on some level he does, I think that it is in the interest to do as much as possible while he is still Archbishop, because we don't know who the next Archbishop is going to be.
Can I just say something about accessing the archives and people who might, when it becomes available, who might be going? I absolutely understand why people might want to go and see the records and read that history. I would just really encourage everyone, and no one more so than survivors, to make sure that you have good support with you when you choose to do that. And to have access to all of the resources that you might need. Because I think there's going to be some beautiful things, hopefully, that will be disclosed. I can give you examples of situations where, people would support victims and things that they were never even aware that people were speaking on their behalf. And I think that can be a beautiful thing. But for every accused priest, no matter how guilty he was, there was 10, 20, 30 people who are saying that the accusations were false. Katie, I think, knows this as well from what she's seen. So just make sure, first of all, those opinions don't matter. That the records are in the archive because the guilt has been established. So first know that, and know that everybody on this panel, me and everyone around, understands that and knows that. But also just make sure that you're taking care of yourself.
I'll just to sort of just jump on that real quick. I'll say that I was corresponding with the university archivist at UNM last week, and one of the things that she did mention to me is that even though they don't have somebody in place, she's been doing research on trauma-informed archives, and sort of thinking about how to sort of approach processing it, and also providing accessibility to it in a way that is thinking about the trauma of the archive. So I do know that the archive at UNM, the archivist at UNM is that's sort of front and center in the way that she's thinking about this archive.
Thank you.
In settlements going forward, we can consider that as well, and maybe having resources to accompany people who are using the archives.
Thank you so much. I just want to invite you for your final thoughts in one last question. Actually, Kathleen just mentioned this question of trauma and archives, and was also brought up in the Q&A one of our participants talks about, I will comment, the comment is just bankruptcy payouts to victims seem to be appallingly low. What can be done to advocate for a more just financial support for their healing? Question is, can the archives play a role on this matter, and also what kind of healing follows from this work, from transparency? I know that I know that it's a complicated question for a final question.
Well, one thing, and maybe this links back to what I was saying, that we've got a difference, right? So the bankruptcy process is a civil law process, right? That looks at an entity and uses a solution that is a civil legal solution. It's a way of making whole for all obligations and then saying that the obligation is done. But that's not how the church understands itself. And so I think, even though you're given 10 counseling sessions or an X amount of money and things like that, your relationship to the church, whether you are actively Catholic or not, does not end, right? Especially the survivors who are baptized in the Catholic Church, that obligation goes on. And so I think there's a pastoral context that you can reach out again if you need additional help.
I mean, I think if I am conceiving of the question properly, like one of the issues we've touched on, all of us have touched on here, is the difficulty of visualizing or having a complete understanding or a complete picture drawn from a variety of scattered archives and sources, and the necessity of patching together a complete picture from a variety of sources, because no one archive from one diocese or one religious order is ever going to give a complete picture of anything, right? All of these stories are interconnected, and all these archives are interconnected, and so it requires a ton of work, right? A ton of digging to sort of piece together a remotely comprehensive picture from all these different sources. The flip side of that is that the more of these archives there are, right, the more sort of independent sources of information there are out there, the harder it is to conceal stuff, because a loose thread in someone else's archive gets pulled on, in the archive at issue, and all of a sudden you start to, get answers to questions that you wouldn't even have been able to ask before. And so the multiplicity of archives, even if it sometimes complicates the task of cross-referencing, becomes a sort of accountability mechanism in and of itself by virtue of being decentralized. If one hand can't keep track of what the other is doing, yeah, you have to investigate two hands, but you can really cross-examine one hand with the other. And that's a sort of interesting duality in all of this.
Thank you, Levi. Anyone else with final comments on this or another question or issue?
Oh, yeah, I think
Yeah, a few comments perhaps on healing. I mentioned a man named Gregory Ford who really began this remarkable archival phenomenon that we're in the middle of. He honestly didn't do it for himself. Shanley, to be blunt, had a terrible effect on his life. I don't think Greg had any interest in reading these documents. I don't think Paul and Rodney, his parents, really did either. They subjected themselves really to additional difficulties, trauma, to make sure that the documents came out and that we would all have the benefit of them, which I think is truly remarkable act of generosity and selflessness. There are other survivors who will really value these documents in a different way, who will understand their value for others, but will also derive comfort from learning how the system works, learning how it was done to them. And there's enormous value in that for people who want to endure that kind of thing. And there are, Jennifer, as you said, there are beautiful things in these archives. There are astonishing letters from survivors, including letters sometimes to their perpetrators. There are amazing acts of generosity and beauty in these documents. And that's one of many reasons, I think, why they need to be preserved.
Yeah, transparency, I mean, is a battle. It's a dream in some ways, right? It's the aspiration, but in the meantime, it's a battle. And
It's a battle.
I think Terry, knows that probably better than anybody based on his longevity in this space. And it is a slog, but it's an incredibly important one, right? This is like some of the richest history around, and I think that when it's viewed, in its full scope, or in as full a scope as we can obtain, it gives us really great insight into really big questions.
Muted.
Thank you so much for that, everyone. I think that's a good note on which to end. Both a note of hope and promise, and a note of recollection of the serious stakes of the conversation, as well as the complexity and layered quality of the issues that we've been discussing. Please join me in thanking our panelists who dedicated their time selflessly to help us understand these complicated questions, and who, beyond that, are working really diligently every day to make the possibility for truth, the possibility for healing, the possibility for accountability, and just the possibility for sitting, as Terry said, between the stories and transparency possible. I would like to just celebrate them and thank everyone who took the time to be with us today on the webinar. I want to encourage anyone whose questions didn't get answered to feel free to forward them along to me at the Taking Responsibility email address, which is available through our website, which has been just posted into the chat. So we will try to do what we can to get those questions answered. We ran out of time, but and I'm sure we could go on for much, much longer. With that, I want to say goodnight and all the best, and please stay in touch with us as we continue this work. All right, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. It was an honor.
Thank you, John. Thanks, everyone.